Today, I'd like to introduce my panelists also. I have with me on my right, Mr. Shahid Kardar, Vice Chancellor of the Beacon House National University, a former central bank governor, and a very respected economist of our country today. Then on my left, we have Dr. Kaisa Bengali, again, a very distinguished economist who has done a number of positions and jobs in government, including as the Planning and Development Minister in the government of Sindh, and then subsequently as an advisor to the government of Balochistan, and has spent many years of his life in active research. So we have a good panel. I hope you will find the discussions interesting and useful. Ladies and gentlemen, out of respect for the Honorable Asma Jahangir, I will start by quoting from the 1973 Constitution of Pakistan, which relates to the vision of a functioning democracy and social welfare state. Ladies and gentlemen, it is remarkable how much emphasis the Constitution of Pakistan lays emphasis on reduction of inequality. In fact, one of the most fundamental principles of policy relate to tackling inequality. If you allow me, I would like to quote one extremely important article from the Constitution, and that is Article 38A, which says, "Secure the well-being of the people, irrespective of sex, caste, creed, or race, by raising their standard of living, by preventing the concentration of wealth." I read again, "by preventing the concentration of wealth and means of production and distribution in the hands of a few, to the detriment of general interest, and by ensuring equal adjustment of rights between employer and employees and landlords and tenants." This is a truly remarkable statement of the vision of our Constitution makers. And it's really, as we will discuss today, perhaps unfortunate that we have not entirely adhered to the spirit of this extremely fundamental article. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll just present one or two statistics, and then I will open up for questions and answers from our panelists. I had the privilege of being the lead author of the recent United Nations Development Program Human Development Report for 2020, the theme of which is inequality. Let me tell you two or three startling statistics. One, it is truly amazing, isn't it, that after a lot of very careful, in-depth, and we like to think objective and unbiased research, we were able to show that the top 1% of the population, the true, if you like, the peak of society, 1% of the population of Pakistan preempts over 9% of the national income. And what is truly amazing is that the share of the national income going to the poorest quintile, the bottom 20% of the population, is 7%. So the top 1% of the population, you might sometimes refer to them as the so-called elite, just 1% of the population, they have access to more income than the bottom 20% of the households in our country, almost something like 6.5 million households. This is a truly unfortunate, perhaps, statistic, but it is a mirror of the realism of the country today. The other two or three statistics that I'd like to present related to the wealth distribution, which is even more distorted. Ladies and gentlemen, and this is official agricultural census data of 2010. 1% of the farmers, the so-called feudal elite, 1%, own 22% of the agricultural land, and a disproportionately large share of the irrigated land. They're usually at the mouths of the canals and the river outlets. 22% with 1% of farmers. And the other very striking statistic, which is more urban related, is that 1% of the property owners own property equivalent to 16% of the total wealth in your country. So with this introduction, let me now turn to my panelists. I'll first turn to my left to Dr. Bengali and ask him the fundamental question. Which segments or groups in our society, in a sense, are on the wrong side of inequality, in the sense that they face discrimination, intolerance, exploitation, and so on? Could you please identify some of those groups which are in the bottom 20 quintile, in the bottom of the 20th quintile, last quintile? Could you then also identify to us the apex of the distribution, which is the top quintile? What are the characteristics, what are the principal features of the 20% top elite or families of Pakistan? Could you please help us in identifying the two ends of the income distribution, the lowest end and the highest end? So with this initial question to profile inequality, I turn over to Dr. Bengali.
A woman of great vision and great courage. I last met her at spent some time with her in Quetta in the Serena Hotel when I was serving Dr. Malik Baloch, sitting here in an advisory capacity. I was head of Dr. Malik had set up a sort of a development cell, which I was heading. And sitting in the lobby of the Serena Hotel, we had a couple of hours to talk. And she said that we have to start building an agenda of campaign for economic rights. That was my last extensive sitting with Asma. And I think it's very apt that in this session today, there are two sessions on the economy, now and then again later in the afternoon. When you said I have to identify which part of the population is on the wrong side of the fence, I was immediately going to say the rich and the powerful. But then you clarified what you meant by it. So let me say this. We have created two Pakistans, and it's very clear. It's visible also. There is a Pakistan which lives, as you rightly said, that looks like California. Palatial houses. If there are 4 people in the house, there are 5 bedrooms. On average, they have 2 cars per house. There are more than 2, but there are, let's say, 2. This is a class whose children have never ever sat in public transport. They don't know what it means to sit in public transport. They go to schools where the per child tuition is 3 times the salary of the chowkidar of that same school. They don't know what the other side is. I once had the occasion to, my nephew lives abroad, came here, and he went to primary school in Pakistan, so he checked up all his old friends, where they were. I used to live in PECHS, which is now a middle class area in Karachi. In the 50s and 60s, it was an upper class, but now it's middle class. And he found that all his friends who used to live in PECHS had moved to defense. So he used to go and meet his friends in defense. One day I couldn't pick him up, so I said, I'm busy, you ask somebody to drop me. And he said, no, none of them have the permission to cross the Clifton Bridge. You know, they can't go to the other side. This is the wrong side of Pakistan. They've never traveled in public transport. You know. Then there is the right side of Pakistan, the poor, the middle class. And the middle class is very small, so it's not really, you can't say much about them. And in the COVID situation, that has shrunk dramatically. Whatever little there was has already shrunk. You know, we personally know people, those who have been our colleagues in different organizations, are poverty-stricken now. They can't pay their rent. They have pulled their children out of school, and so on and so forth. They live in 2-room houses, kachi abadis. And in fact, our research, and I have had the privilege of working with Dr. Pasha for almost 20 years as colleagues in Karachi University and later also. Dr. Pasha was also my advisor for my PhD. We have done, in fact, it was Dr. Pasha who introduced me to urban economics and to housing and things like that. We have come across families where they live 20 to a room. And they say that we don't know what it means to sleep with our legs stretched out because there isn't enough space. You know, and we found this in Lahore also. You know, Punjab has very high economic indicators compared to the rest of the province. How much time do I have?
You'll have to conclude in 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll just finish. There is a population below the poverty line, and then we talk of severity of poverty. How below the poverty line? How much below? Lahore we came across as the highest in terms of severity of poverty. There are poor people, but the very low below the poverty line we found in Lahore. And this is the glamour city now as you drive around. So I think this is what we have done. There is a ashrafia, the elite, on the wrong side of the fence, and there is the mass of people, middle class, poor, living in slum houses, quarters, 1-room houses, traveling on buses on top of bus, hanging out of windows, no schooling, no education. And I want to conclude by saying that this is deliberate. This is not accidental.
Thank you. I think for a very useful, passionate statement. Nevertheless, I think representative of reality. Let me just give you 1 or 2 further statistics to support what Dr. Bengali has been saying. The population census's detailed results came out recently. And you know, one of the truly shocking statistics is that there are over 2 million families in Pakistan with 8 or more household members who live in 1 room. I mean, this is unbelievable. But that is the reality of your country. It's amazing how high, and this number, the squeeze on housing and the inability to afford and the lack of access to any form of housing credit, all these have led to this. And the interesting is that our government, with all due respects to it, wants to focus on new housing, whereas the real approach would have been simply to give small, augmented funding to build another room. And believe me, the contribution that would have made to poverty reduction would have been much, much greater. But then the lobby of the big builders is very powerful in this country. And when I was invited by the new housing authority to speak, when I spoke on improvement versus construction, I was almost laughed at. Let me also say that the regional context is very important. I'm glad that Dr. Malik is here from Balochistan. The National Human Development Report of UNDP highlights that the unfortunate soft underbelly, if I may use that expression, Chief Minister, if you don't mind, is Balochistan. 15 years have elapsed, and there has been no growth in real per capita income in Balochistan, despite the so-called fiscal equalization by the 7th NFC award. Balochistan has not moved ahead. And you know what the nature of the problem is. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Dr. Bengali, for a very, very stimulating and passionate introduction. And I will turn now to Dr. Shahid Kardar, who has a very distinguished record of being involved in policy making in this country as a former governor of the State Bank of Pakistan and a number of other positions. I'd like you to take you to the contemporary context, if I may, Kardar Saab. The first question is, what do you think has been the impact of COVID-19 on inequality in our country? And in your assessment, has our government done enough to alleviate the loss of lives and livelihoods that we saw over the last 1.5 years, almost? My second question is in perhaps even more sensitive question, but as a former central bank governor, you will be able to handle it. The prior actions and other reforms which we are being compelled to implement in the ongoing IMF reform as part of the program under the 6th review, there are some of the toughest reforms proposed in the history of our country. Are they likely to be helpful in reducing inequality? Or is there a real risk that they will exacerbate inequality issues? So Kardar Saab, two very pointed questions, COVID and its impact, and what is likely to happen with the IMF program reforms being implemented. So over to you.
Thank you. Let me start by paying homage to two of my mentors. Two great warriors. They were always comrades in arms. Of course, Asma and Mr. I.A. Rahman. I've spent my lifetime with them as a founder member of the HRCP and the so-called lifelong treasurer of that institution. I've never met people like them who could have fought so courageously against what you and I would call the tyranny of state institutions, and of course all kinds of social injustices. So for me, it was a unique pleasure to have known them and befriended them. Now, let me just start off by saying 2-3 things very quickly in support of what Paisab and Kesser have said. Of course, the visual contrast that we see in the lifestyles of the rich and the poor couldn't have been more stark in this country now. I mean, one of the things that Kesser mentioned, I'm just emphasizing it. In our, in my younger days, that feels like prehistoric times. We went to the same schools. We went to the same institutions. Our children, by the way, don't go to the same colleges, don't go to the same institutions, follow Manchester United. So in a sense, they frankly, and the walls which separate them, the poor cannot really cross. So the social mobility aspect has actually been denuded completely over the several years. One of the areas that I'd like to highlight, because that also brings into the question of the IMF program, those of you who read the press must have noticed, the complaint about imports, what's happening to our external account. I think what we forget is the impact of inequality on that. And let me just illustrate it with some. What are luxury cars? When you import luxury cars, that's included in the import bill. And then, of course, you start the import of parts. Then you have oil, consumer products, again, because the elite can afford them. I hate the word elite because I really often wonder how to classify it in terms of groups. Okay. Recreational travel, Hajj and Umrah. I mean, in case we don't realize the impact of the exchange rate, on the exchange rate, Hajj and Umrah, by the way, annually costs us $3 billion. And then we forget conveniently the 50,000 students who go abroad every year. That's another $3 billion, by the way, $3 billion, because of assuming they actually study for roughly 2 to 2.5 years abroad. So in a sense, which is the 20%, I keep asking. I mean, you drive down any of the even middle-class localities, these are essentially $500,000 houses. So which is the 20%? I keep asking myself. And I'll come to where I depart from the two of them to raise questions which I keep wondering myself, and I'll come to them in the end. Well, let me respond to the two specific questions that have been asked. According to government's own surveys, almost 12% of the population, the employed labor force, became unemployed. So which a labor force of 65 million, 12% is roughly 550,000 people who lost their jobs. And some of them will never get their jobs back. A lot of consolidation took place, particularly in the retail sector, which is really the much more labor-intensive sector. And because I happen to know a lot of them, they're either parts of the family or very close friends, there has been a lot of consolidation in terms of the number of retail outlets. So in a sense, when you look at what is happening, a lot of the salaries were halved. Some of them came back, but not kept pace with inflation. So some of them returned to their salaries almost 18 months later, but no revisions in terms of the impact of inflation that Kessler talked about. So 14 million households the government has been trying to help, roughly 1,000 rupees per family per month, which is 12,000 rupees a year, given on a quarterly basis. And now, of course, is advertised another program which has not yet been implemented, but certainly been announced, of 120 billion rupees, which will cover roughly, which will cover these households for an additional 6 months. That's over consumer products, although 65% will have to be borne by the provinces. So in a sense, some things have happened. People have been hit very badly by COVID and, of course, the inflation part. Inflation, in fact, has had the more damaging impact. COVID far less now, but inflation has been the more damaging part to what has happened. And how it has affected social cohesion, I think, is something that we need to. Pakistan, frankly, has become a very, very difficult country to govern. We take that very lightly. Okay, I'll come to it in 3 minutes. We take that very lightly. I mean, it would be challenging for the most capable leadership anywhere in the world. The kind of crises, and we talked about the provincial dimension, the fact of the lack of social cohesion, the alienation between the youth of different provinces, and then, of course, between different socioeconomic classes. So in a sense, what we have managed to create is an overburdening state structure, which has been, and of course the imperatives of the security state, let me not go into those, but that has created a burden which all of us are now having to finance, and I'm talking about the poor much more than anyone else. And that brings me to the final part of the question, but I'll make a presentation later on what I think of the inequality aspects, which some of the dimensions are not, in my opinion, taken care of. So the IMF program, because it assumes, and to a large extent, because IMF programs are essentially for 3 years, and now it ends in September, much of the burden is going to be through indirect taxes, because that's all they're interested in. They're looking at numbers. They're not looking at how changes should take place in society. That's not their business. It's our business to correct our house in order. We seem to think that we have an open-ended license to mismanage our affairs when someone should come and bail us out. Oh, it was great. With the Cold War, the 9/11, the war against terror, the Afghan war, and then, of course, 9/11 and so on. And no one can really help a country of 220 million people, so let's first be clear. So all the adjustments have to be done here. Surgery is required. You can't take the patient abroad. The patient will be here, and the doctors have to be local. Now, how that surgery will take place is the debate that needs to be taken, the debate that needs to be made. Now, in terms of the IMF program, unfortunately, the focus is now on the indirect taxes part, which is the GST part. And for the poor, the impact will be huge.
Yes.
A lot of the items which had been exempted from sales tax will now be subjected to sales tax at 17%, with an already inflated cost of consumer goods because of inflation. And this will put a burden far more. And Kasser mentioned the fact that they were pulling children out of school. Two things are also happening. One, apart from the fact that, so now the malnutrition part will increase. It is already, by the way, rising. And some of the unemployed in the urban areas, frankly, are going back to their villages. Yeah. That's the other interesting or sad part which is happening simultaneously as we speak. So I'll stop here just to address the two questions. But there are other areas that need to be talked about.
Thank you. Thank you, Kardar Saab. Now let me turn to one of the findings of the United Nations Development Program, Human Development Report for Pakistan for 2020, which did a long-term historical analysis of the trend in inequality in Pakistan, and found a fairly strong correlation between the nature of government and the trend in inequality. The conclusion that was reached, broadly speaking, was that generally authoritarian governments are accompanied by periods of rising inequality. And perhaps the most vivid manifestation in our history of rising inequality, which had profound implications for our country, was the so-called rapid growth in the Field Marshal Ayub Khan era, which led to the emergence of 22 families, and perhaps one of the reasons for the loss of the Eastern Wing. Then, of course, the Musharraf era. The other interesting correlation is that generally democratic regimes, despite perhaps their inability to mobilize the kind of growth momentum, nevertheless, we have seen declines in inequality during these periods. And perhaps the best example of this, which has not been highlighted much in the literature, but now by UNDP, is the decade of the 90s, where we had for bulk of the period, democracy. And one of the breakthroughs in that period was agriculture and self-sufficiency in food. And that helped enormously in reducing poverty and inequality. We have never talked very much about that period, success in reducing inequality. So I'll turn now to Dr. Bengali, who's done a lot of research on the trends in inequality. Why is there this tendency that in our history, in the past 30 years of military government, we have seen rising inequality mostly? And perhaps the Ziaul Haq period is a slight exception. It remained somewhat low. And why is it that during democratic periods we have seen a fall in inequality? Is there some kind of a rational explanation for this?
There were so many pluses that we have during the 1990s. Yes. It was a politically chaotic period, chaos created from some corner of Rawalpindi, but it was certainly not a lost decade. Generally, what is highlighted is not the rise in inequality during authoritarian periods. What is highlighted is that the growth rate during authoritarian period is high and low during civilian period. So let's have authoritarian governments. But the fact is that in Zia's time, you know, if, there is a very good cartoon I saw, it was done by some Latin American radical groups, that there is this map of North and South America. There is a tree that grows in South America and its branches go in North America. The workers in South America are toiling, watering the tree, and then the North Americans are plucking the fruit. You know, this is exactly what happened. The 70s was a golden period of Pakistan's history. Again, it is beaten that nationalization hurt this economy. I have actually checked the numbers. My question to myself was almost 20, 25 years ago, or 30 years ago, was when Pakistan broke up in 71, we lost a war, there was massive damages. Why didn't the economy collapse? It didn't. 71, the country broke up. The fiscal year 72, 73, all numbers are looking good. Exports are going up, government revenue went up. So it was a conundrum that I was trying to answer. So my answer is that nationalization actually saved the economy. If there was no nationalization, these 22 families would have taken their money and run. And the country would have collapsed. But the fact that nationalization made sure that capital remains within the country saved the economy. Just one example I'll give you of this tree that I gave you. There were massive capital investments in the 70s under the Bhutto government. Port Qasim, heavy mechanical complex, heavy electrical complex, Indus Highway, chemical industry, the whole basis of the chemical industry was set up. Port Qasim. If you plot the industrial production from the CMI, Census of Manufacturing Industries, over a long period, you will see from the 60s to 1974 and onwards, there's a growing line, a very healthy growing line. But in 1982, there is a sudden jump up, and then it goes up again. Why this sudden up? Because the steel mill, which was construction started in 1974, under the civilian government, came into production in 1982 under the military government, and suddenly there was a burst of industrial output. That's what gives you high growth rates during military period of Zia. Musharraf time, it was all fudged. All the numbers are fraudulent. And I say this with full professional responsibility in my capacity, that all the numbers are fraudulent during the Musharraf period. So we don't believe anything. Now, why civilian periods give you better income and equality? Because the politicians who have to answer to the people, they may be corrupt. They may be filling their pockets, but they also have to give something to the people. The generals who run this country don't even have contact with the people. I was in the first year of Musharraf's government, there was an ex-ISI chief who was railway minister. And he said that I am going to make railways profitable in 1 year. And his way of doing it was that remove all the Kachi Abadis on railway land, sell the land, and the railway will be profitable. You know? So they came, we got a call, I happened to be in Lahore that day. We got a call at 4 o'clock in the morning that the bulldozers have arrived. So all of us went there and stood in front of the bulldozers. I said, okay, first you have to bulldoze us before you. By the way, I'm also been on the streets, fighting, you know. I'm not just an economist doing with numbers. So we went there and we stood before the bulldozers and said, okay, first you bulldoze us before you bulldoze the houses. And the people around, now the MNA during the preceding Nawaz Sharif government was Tariq Aziz, the famous TV personality. He was no longer MNA. And the people around had gathered and had said, who to call? He said, call Tariq Aziz. Tariq Aziz is no longer MNA, he can't help us. Then, and who is in charge? And there was some Colonel something Salim or somebody. Anybody know Colonel Salim? Nobody knew Colonel Salim. So with politicians, you have access. I have seen Qaim Ali Shah, Chief Minister of Balochistan, people catching him by the collar and demanding, the Sindh Chief Minister. And I think the politicians have to get, you know, in Balochistan, Dr. Saab is sitting here, there is this accusation that whenever Balochistan gives money, it hires people and the money is spent in salaries. But what can any government in Balochistan do? Where can they give jobs from? There is no infrastructure to give jobs. The only thing they can do in the short run is to give jobs as peons in the government. Because people have to eat today. You can't tell people that this project is coming in 3 years, you will be well off. This is why we have better income distribution in civilian periods. And I think a friend of mine, Asad Saeed, Dr. Asad Saeed once said that corruption is across the board. In military periods, corruption is accumulative, and in civilian period, corruption is distributive.
Wonderful and brilliant. Very good. Let me tell you also that when we wrote this in the United Nations Development Program, Human Development Report, where types of government and impact on inequality varies, you can imagine what I had to go through. But I'm still alive, Allah ka shukr hai. So now let me turn to the next very important question again. It is hardcore policy question and none better than Mr. Kardar. One of the very strange and unusual characteristics of the taxation system of Pakistan is that if you include the withholding taxes of an indirect nature in income tax, you will be really amazed to know that almost 75% of tax revenues accrue in the form of indirect taxes. And Mr. Kada referred to the fact that this is going to get worse with the IMF program. One would like to know what has been the historical reason why Pakistan has this disproportionate dependence on indirect taxes which fall disproportionately on the poorer sections of our society. Kardar Saab, please enlighten us.
I think it's fairly well documented by now that the more affluent segments of society were able to have that kind of access. I mean, let's start with the feudal, the large landowners. They've exempted themselves from taxes and they sit in parliament, most of them. So in a sense, a good source of income which should really be taxed based on their ability to bear a particular burden, they are not doing so. So that's one example. Then we have an excellent example, and Professor talked about the houses that we look at. It's the property tax part, where people living in, I mean, I can give you actual numbers, people living in 4,000 square yards are actually paying a property tax of less than $200. Prime property, maintained by the state and maintained by the local government. Then you have capital gains, people actually interacting in economic transactions related to land, the stock market, and of course, very lightly taxed. And then those holding financial assets in the form of either equity or in the form of large deposits pay a much lower rate of tax. So I mean, it's that which, the system which seems to be rigged against every other segment of society. They've been fully protected, and of course continue to get that protection. I mean, the most recent example being the relief given, so-called relief given to the construction sector. So in a sense, the system has actually historically been rigged in favor of the richer segments of society. And I can go on as to the number of things that have happened. I totally agree, political governments have responded because they have no choice. They have to fight an election every 5 years, and they are forced to respond despite not being able to change the structure in a much more favorable manner towards the less affluent segments of society. I know we're very fond of running down Pindi. I fall in that same category. But I keep asking myself 3-4 questions. One, who negotiated the independent power projects that we are all lamenting about? The civilian side. Who runs the steel mill and made what it is today? Again, us. The way we can't seem to do anything about the education sector is again us. The Pindiwalas are not stopping you from doing that. We can't seem to run the railways, we can't seem to run PIA. And I think we must ask ourselves, it's very easy to run down Pindi, I hold no brief for them. But we must ask ourselves as well, because we don't realize the drain, just to give you an example, the drain of these mismanaged state-owned enterprises, which means some of the money has to come through indirect taxes, is now 2.3 trillion. Yes. And who's going to pay for it? Because the more affluent segments of society are not going to pay for it. So no wonder you end up, and then you have the size of the state structure. Even after the 18th Amendment, the size of the federal government is increased. Why? It is in the interest of both politicians and bureaucrats to have a large federal government. The bureaucrat is thinking, I don't want to retire not being a secretary. The politicians is looking for a ministerial position. So in a sense, some of the things that we should have done, frankly, we haven't. One other item that I'll emphasize, and I think there are other questions which, one of the things we don't realize in terms of the inequality part is that the size of households has actually come down and narrowed. The number of persons per household amongst the richest segments of society have reduced. Yes. And at the lower end, it's the other way. So in a sense, if you look at the per capita terms, the inequality gap has actually grown. There is much more purchasing power now with the top 20%, which wasn't the case earlier because they had large families. So that aspect has also grown. And so I'll just stop here.
Actually, just to confirm what Mr. Kardar just said, the latest Household Integrated Economic Survey indicates that in the top 20% households in Pakistan, the average family size is 4.2. This includes the 2 adults. So they are very close now to 2 adults and 2 children, which is a kind of a very balanced family. But interestingly, and he's absolutely right, Over the last few decades, we have seen the number in the lowest quintile households. Their family size now is 8.6. And they do tend to have 1 or 2 adult dependents also. So that means on the average, they could have as many as 5.5 to 6 children. And this is where the lack of emphasis on population control and planning in Pakistan, unlike our old brother country, today Bangladesh has one of the lowest population growth rates in the world of 1.4%. And we persist with almost 2.4%. Let me now, in the last session, move on to what should we be doing? We have all diagnosed, and I'm grateful to Mr. Kardar for having given a somewhat more balanced perspective on the military versus the political and democratic process. Both have had their failings. But at the end of the day, out of my deep respect for Mohtarma Asma Jahangir and others who fought for civil rights, my vote still would remain with the political process. And he has himself qualified it now by saying, and earlier, of course, that we all committed to democracy, but democracy which is meaningful and has impact. Okay, the question now to Dr. Bengali, and the same question will be addressed also to Kardar Saab, is as follows. Please identify policies, changes in laws, and other institutional governance changes which you think can make a significant contribution to reducing inequality in our beloved country. Over to Dr. Bengali, and then followed by Kardar Saab.
So before I specifically answer this question, I want to comment on what Shahid has said. I can take issues with specifics examples, but I think on balance, I agree with what he has said. You know, the real divide in Pakistan, the structural divide is not between military and civilian. It is a class divide. The upper class, whether of the military or of the civilian, are aligned and united. And they follow similar policies. It's a horizontal thing. I had an occasion many years back. A friend of us died in a car accident. He was about in his late 30s, wife and 2 young children. He was in the military CMH in Rawalpindi for 41 days before he died. Their trauma center. And I had taken the responsibility of night duty there, because his family, he had no other family over there. And I came across rank discrimination between officers and non-officers in the military. So it's not just the civilians who are discriminated. Within the military, the lower ranks are discriminated against. If you look at the civilians, there is an alliance. There is an English, Pakistani, British economist who's recently done some work, that the Gadi Nasheens of Sindh and Balochistan have ruled all along in whatever government comes. Then there is this new urban classes that have begun, especially the property classes, the land property builders, and a couple of them who have the stock market mafias that have emerged. They make enormous money. And all of them, some we know, personally know their relationships with the military. So there is a class divide. Now the question, Pasha Saab, what to do? Laws and policies is not going to change this, because the absolute control over the whole machinery making laws and policies, it with the very people who are benefiting from this rotten system. No, we have to fight. We have to fight on the streets. हल जो है वो बातों में नहीं है, बगावत में है. आए बगावत करें.
Mashallah, mashallah. You know, sitting here as a kind of a remotely placed professor, I must say I'm very stimulated by the discussions today. Thank you, Mr. Bengali. My only point was, what is the agenda that social movement should be pushing for? What are the rights which we have to be asking for? What are the laws that we need to ask for when we agitate, as he suggests, on the street? This agenda has to emerge from a very, very deep understanding of the root causes of inequality. And that is why I am glad that he has announced a street-wide movement. Wonderful. But we will help him by giving him some agenda. So I'll turn to Kardar Saab and ask him, perhaps he can give us some specific issues that need to be focused on through legislation achieved through public participation and movement.
And I like what Kasser said about that they've ruled all along. Huh? All that was changing was the party in government. So they're the ones who actually switched from party to party. The other thing, Jahan Tak, he mentioned the Bagawat or the revolution that he refers to. I think we seem, while we are talking, that's all we do. I mean, I can only put myself in that category. The boys in the TLP and the others are telling us what the way is. And I think I tend to agree with you that when we talk about laws, we seem to be talking about sections of the law. While those guys are saying, forget this law, these guys will never let you have any kind of social mobility. And so that, to me, is the crux of the matter. How do we create a system which provides that kind of social mobility which you would expect to see in any civilized society? A decent system of economic and social services which enables them to get the kind of education, the kind of skills that will give them that mobility. I think, to me, that's the key, and that's where we've actually failed to provide completely. To me, that is the starting point. The second is that we keep forgetting that we are a federation. The federation requires us to be actually use all the institutions that we have, and that is the CCI, the National Economic Council, the parliamentary committees, and that's the one which will give them, and of course this government has decided not to use any of these institutions. So that is the key to be able to have that kind of stakeholder participation to create that kind of social cohesion that we're looking for. As regards the resources part, to be able to pay for all this and give people a fairly decent way forward, I think much of the problem, frankly, lies on the expenditure side and not on the revenue side. In my opinion, it's the bloated state which needs to be adjusted, and frankly worry about the revenue part later. The reason I emphasize it, every time you give them an additional rupee, they will actually start using it for something else, for their own lifestyles, for the lifestyles of the presters and those in Pindi. Now, the reason I emphasize it, I think is critical, because we need to recognize that this way of governance, this way of both economic and political governance needs to change. That is what essentially is dragging us down. And how we manage to do it through a broader stakeholder participation is important. The rich must pay their way. Adjustments in society will have to be born based on different groups' ability to bear that burden. The rich must pay a much higher burden, and that brings us to the whole question of income taxes, the wealth taxes, and things like that. It's until unless we change this system, which is much fairer than what we've managed to do so far, I think we will never get the kind of acceptance. I mean, and I'll end by saying, when I started reading about these young kids who were wearing suicide belts, I used to ask myself, why is it he wants to end up in heaven? Is that the somehow what you and I will call the propaganda that he's imbibed and swallowed? No, the reason was very simple. Have you given him a stake in this system? Have you given him a stake? If he wants to blow it up, I can understand. He has no stake in this system. You have to give him a stake in this system, which requires a much fairer and a much more just society, the kind of society that Asma and the Ayar Imams of this world are fighting for. Thank you.
Sentence, please go ahead, and then we will conclude.
You know, I agree with Shahid that this state has to be shrunk. But whenever this is discussed, it means privatize industries, get the state out of it. I think that's a small part of the state. The real part of the state that we have to shrink is the defense. Without talking about defense, it is no longer possible to do anything in this country. So I think that's where we have to concentrate.
Let me just add one or two sentences, and then we will open up. Do we have some 10-15 minutes for discussion, for participation by the audience? Yes, I'll give you an opportunity. I just want to dedicate, if I may, this session particularly to women and children. You know, the inequality issue manifest in gender inequality has an exceptionally brutal element and characteristic to it in our culture. I'm truly, truly ashamed. I'll just give you one or two statistics. 10.5 million women of Pakistan are in what is known as marginal occupations. Marginal occupations, where they suffer the worst form of exploitation. 10.5 million women. The other brutal statistic is for the same job, and these are official government statistics, same job, same qualification, same experience, a woman gets 40% less. And finally, I want to dedicate to the children. Do you know that in this beloved country of ours, this is truly shocking and we have tears in our eyes. 22 million children do not go to school in this country. This is brutal. This is brutal manifestation of the neglect and lack of concern for our children and the future generation of Pakistan. So the panel has concluded. I will take a few questions because we have 15 to 20 minutes, starting with you, then to you, madam, and then to you.
I am a son of a former Nasser Javed Ghumman, Advocate Supreme Court.
Oh.
I run an organization, Kisan Bachao Tehreek Pakistan, farmers organization. Today I was late, as the farmers of my community were protesting myself that the administration is forcing and lodging FIRs against them for burning the rice. What to do? Neither the government is supporting nor the to make other measures. Then we have only this one. So we want to have a protest. My question this week, discussion is this, that what is the basic need of this country? Livelihood, khana, roti, pani, kharcha. Yehi chahiye. Either it is available from the agriculture, industry or trade. Whatever I have learned from my life, that neither this country has been given by trade, it has failed, industry has failed. Only agriculture is the base, and that has to be taken, and that.
Thank you. I think we'll have.
Question आ रहा है.
जी question करें.
Question मेरा भी आ रहा है.
जी जी.
अब मैं वो base दे दिया.
जी जी.
Whether if the agriculture sector is subsidized in this respect that the no tax should be imposed upon the agriculture sector, and if the roti, dal और कोई चीज़ ऐसी सब्जी खाना चाहता है, that should be available to him free. But if he needs something, double roti, jam of any company, he should be taxed.
But there's still a comment. Please ask the question.
ये मेरा question है कि whether you all remain in the portfolios, even the Castle Bengali remained in the government sector, whether this would not be run process.
Okay, thank you, thank you. I hope my participants will be understanding the implication of your very important question, sir. Yes, please.
That lady wants to ask a question.
Thank you. But please make your question brief.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Usama Ahmed and I'm from Punjab University Law College. My question is that the governance model we are seeing in Pakistan is controlled chaos theory. There are certain elements that produce chaos in every form. The form is different in every province, but the thing is that we are following the controlled chaos theory. What are your comment on this, and how can we cope from this?
Okay.
We have seen democracy, we have seen dictatorship, but the thing going on same.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And, you know, you may end up creating some chaos. So I have to stop you. Wonderful question. I will turn to the young lady, and after that I'll come to you, ma'am.
Hello, I'm Nayab Wali from LUMS. I just had a question that as a young citizen of this country, we don't have any hope in terms of any financial security within this country. We are very pessimistic, we are very hopeless. So if there is this one advice or if in reality there is any optimism or anything in future for us, how should we stay back in this country? Or if we should not, and if we are staying back, what would be some sort of incentives, financial for us, especially young women, to stay back in this country? So if you could shed light on
Thank you.
this.
Very good question. And madam, piche hain aap.
Assalamu alaikum ji, Faria Salahuddin. I'm an ex-banker, also working with LUMS at the moment. Very simple question. What do you suggest as an August panel here for us to do on our individual levels to make the change begin today in Pakistan rather than the bigger policy makers?
Thank you. I think we have had, okay, quickly, very quickly, one more, and I'll turn to the panel to respond. They can choose which questions they want to respond to. Please.
My name is Kaleem Khan. I am serving session judge. The question is that we as general people believe that the economy has sunk almost in Pakistan. Our debts are around 90% of the GDP. Every year we are facing a gap of 3,000 to 4,000 billion rupees. So being expert, we carry some optimism, but now we are getting pessimist.
Question.
Is there any question of hope?
Hope.
Yeah.
The question, bottom line is there hope? Yes, I think, yes, please. But as long as it's few words.
My name is Abdullah Malik, advocate. My question is whether strong defense is the source of growing economy, or growing economy is the strong defense.
Okay. I will now turn first to Mr. Kardar. And he will, by choice, answer the questions. And then Mr. Bengali, Dr. Bengali will take on some of the questions. If there are any questions left, it will be my duty to try and respond to them. So please, Kardar Saab.
The first question, I'll come to the agriculture in a moment. The local elections part will certainly make it, hopefully, if you can have local governments which are much more, how should I put it, empowered, both in terms of resource flows and, of course, responsibilities and powers in terms of administrative powers, then at least we'll have a system which is much more responsive to the needs of the local people. But we need to rethink the kind of structure that was originally thought of. I mean, I'll give you an example of the old local government ordinance, which is repeatedly mentioned. The old local government ordinance assumed that the problem was The problem was that we need to have a local system. That assumed that somehow people in Lahore were happy because the provincial government was also here. So what we ended up doing, actually, having a local government system which imbibed the structure of the provincial government. So it was just as aloof and distant as other places. So in a sense, that structure needs to be rethought of. As far as agriculture is concerned, one, there is no doubt that we need to focus on the agriculture, and particularly the water part that we have really neglected for a long time. But there is a part which farmers also need to play, in the sense of the productivity per acre, the yields per acre, which haven't really grown. And we have continued to be, and the farming community has continued to be subsidized by the other people. As regards incentives for women, the young ladies no longer have. Yeah, there are no incentives in life. It's very simple. All you need is to ensure that we have a system which is merit-driven. And this talk of women needing further incentives, frankly, when we were growing up, women had hardly any professions in which to go to. The number of professions which have gone up, and the number of females now working. I mean, I just see the number of females actually managing this conference as an example. That you're lucky to be born in an era where these opportunities now have opened up. And all we need is a much more merit-driven system. And how you do it in the state sector versus what happens in the private sector. The private sector essentially actually runs much more on the merit-oriented business. That's one of the tragedies of not having a merit-driven system. If when it comes to the cricket team, everyone is worried. Ki ye batsman ye hona chahiye tha, bowler ye hona chahiye tha. So everyone is worried because we have to compete globally. We forget the nations also have to compete globally. It's not just cricket teams which have to. So in a sense, and when it comes to nations, governments start talking about ye hamare halke ka hai, ye mera bhatija hai. Iske paas 10,000 vote hai. So that's where the merit-driven system comes in. So if we can have a much more responsive governance system, how we will get it? One argument could be we continue to have a political system which runs, and over a period of time people will be forced to change. How long should we wait? Should we wait as long as it has taken a lot of other countries? But now we know, thanks to technology, thanks to experience that we see of other countries, we can encapsulate years of progress over a much shorter period than that was the case for other countries. I'll stop. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
What future for us? Is there hope? I think it all depends on your own hands. If you give up, then of course, no, you can't help yourself. So basically, it's in your hands. I said fight on the streets, but I think we have a very, very powerful tool, which is the internet, social media. You should be aware. I'm addressing the young people here. You should make sure that you are aware of what's happening every day. Read the news. Whenever I used to be a full-time teacher. Now I'm a part-time teacher. Whenever I teach, I tell my class that one question in every exam will be from the newspapers, which has forced the whole class to read newspapers every day. You know, which normally they don't do. So, read newspapers, read articles. You can even get foreign papers now on your internet. You know, you can get New York Times, for example, if you want to, for a very small amount of money. So I think being informed is very important, and then express your opinion on social media. Come and give it. It has an impact. Don't think it does not have any. It has an impact. On the agriculture and economy, basically for the last 40 years, I recently wrote a report. It's called Economy on a Roller Coaster. It documents the economy from 1990 to 2015. Average crop sector growth rate is 1.5% per annum. If you have a good performance in 1 year, the next year it crashes. If you have a good cotton crop in 1 year, that same year the wheat crop has crashed. If you have a good wheat crop, the cotton crop. This is basically, since the last 20 years, since the Musharraf, Shaukat Aziz era, we've turned our economy basically into a casino economy. Money is made through speculation in the stock market, in the property market, in the commodity markets. Commodities growth sectors, agriculture and industry are declining. There is no investment. Infrastructure is deteriorating and all across the board. So this is an explicit policy decision which was made by Shaukat Aziz. So now I want to come to Your Excellency, your question on local government, very fundamental. I think it's extremely important to have functioning local government because that is where I can walk across my street and go and ask for something. It gives that empowerment. But we've been talking about local government all along. The problem is that the Constitution of Pakistan has 2 chapters. There's a chapter, several chapters. 2 chapters are, one is on the federal government and one is on the provincial government. Each of these chapters clearly define the structure, powers, and functions of these 2 levels of government. There is no chapter on local government, except one line, one clause, I think 140 probably. We have 148. So it gives the entire blank check to provincial governments. They can do what they like. They can take away the powers, they can give powers, change functions, hold elections, not hold elections for 20 years. So what we really need to fight for a chapter in the Constitution. Once it is in the Constitution, just because if a provincial assembly is dissolved, I think in 90 or 120 days, it is compulsory to hold elections. It's in the Constitution. So local government chapter defining its powers, its functions, and its structure should be in the Constitution. Once it is there, it will have permanence. Otherwise, it is just a matter of one notification. One notification took away the powers of garbage collection from Karachi Municipal Corporation and provincial government took it over. Just one line notification. That should not be allowed. It is happening because there's this missing chapter in the Constitution.
Thank you.
I had one quick thing about the social media. What is interesting also, it has also made governance much more difficult for government. In a sense, the younger people now are exposed to not just social media, but thanks to cable television and the internet, the expectations based on what they see and what they read are very high. So managing expectations for politicians, for governments has become much more difficult, much more difficult.
Okay. In conclusion, let me just try and answer that question which you have raised, which is a very valid question. And it relates, of course, to efforts at trying to limit pollution, but in a very arbitrary and a high-handed fashion. The sources are very diverse, and unfortunately, Lahore today is rated as one of the most polluted cities in the world. Let me, in conclusion, highlight 2 or 3 things and try and, if I may, introduce an element of optimism about our country. The first thing is, it's a very interesting country, a country which has gone for the highest number of IMF programs in the history of any world country, global country. 22 programs, which means that, and this all started from 1988 onwards. So over the last roughly 43 years, Pakistan has gone in for 22 programs, crisis every 2 years. And yet, Pakistan comes out of every crisis. This is, I'm proud to say, a remarkably resilient nation. Somehow or the other, and I see this every day in families. When there is a crisis, the people come together and somehow or the other work together to find a way to surmount a particular short-run crisis or difficulty. This is a characteristic of this country and our people, which inshallah, will always be there. The other information that I'd like to convey to you, particularly our international participants, do you know that despite having almost double the per capita income in India, India has twice the per capita income in purchasing power dollars, do you know that despite all our drawbacks and despite all our failures, according to the World Bank, which is unbiased, Pakistan has a lower incidence of poverty than India today. And Pakistan has less inequality than India today. Of course, we need to do more. And we keep quoting Bangladesh. Bangladesh actually does not do much better than us in inequality. And one of the reasons for that, I have served as the Under Secretary General of the United Nations, and Bangladesh was my territory. The exploitation of the garment female worker is unbelievable in the Bangladesh context. And I had to fight against this. So there are other examples of other countries which have similar problems. God willing, whether we go on the street or not, or whether we agitate in other ways, I remain optimistic. Inshallah, our country will stay fixed on moving ahead, and one day, inshallah, Pakistan will be in the committee of the more developed nations. Thank you all very much. Assalamu alaikum.